this. Welcome to session 3, Map Fixations, Toponymies and Allegories. Please keep your microphones silenced as you can see on the etiquette slide that was sent out to everyone, and send any questions to me. I will change my name so you'll see moderator there, but it's Catherine Parker, and all you need to do is send a private chat to the moderator, and then I will be able to pose those questions to our panelists in the discussion portion of this. So my username will be moderator, but my real name is Katie Parker. I work on Pacific mapping in the long 18th century. So we have 3 speakers this session who are each going to be speaking for 15 minutes, followed by a more general discussion with all 3 of them on the topic of the panel and their papers. So first is going to be Carolina Martinez, a researcher at CONICET in Argentina, an assistant professor at the University of Buenos Aires and the Universidad Nacional de San Martín. She is also one of the inaugural editors of ISHMaps, which you can learn about tomorrow at 10 a.m. if you come to our little meet and greet session in the hallway. Our second speaker is going to be Manuel Detoni Flores. He's a graduate student at the Universidade Federal de Rio Grande do Sul. Sorry, I speak Spanish, not Portuguese. And he has worked on a variety of initiatives, including one with Fabio Kuhn on the role of military engineers in cartography in Portuguese America. And our third speaker is going to be Brenda Degger. She's a graduate student at the Universidade Federal de Paraná, and she's interested in the imagery and imaginary of maps, as we'll see with her presentation in just a bit. So Carolina, do you want to go ahead and share your PowerPoint and get us started?
Yeah, wait a second. Because just a moment, share screen. It says you cannot start screen share while other participant is sharing.
Yeah, I think we need our secretary to stop his screen share, please. There we go. I think you should be able to do it now.
Mm-hmm. So I'm sharing my screen now and I'm making it bigger.
Lovely.
Are you seeing the full image?
Yes, we are.
Okay, wait a second, because now. Sorry, my internet crashed right before the session started, so I had to download Zoom again and everything. So I'm asking for your patience. I won't be able to make it big. I mean, are you seeing it full screen or partially?
No, we're seeing it just as if we were in PowerPoint.
Okay, so unfortunately, you'll have to see it that way because okay. I won't be able to show it the other way around. I apologize.
Fine, we get a preview of what's coming. It's great.
Okay, so my presentation today addresses 2 topics concerning New World toponyms in the age of discovery. Firstly, and more generally, it delves into the reasons behind the dislocation of place names from the Old to the New World in the 3 centuries of European overseas expansion. Secondly, and more specifically, it proposes to answer, at least partially in the minutes that follow, why Thule became an appropriate place name to designate a small island of the South Sandwich Archipelago when it was originally a mythical island located in the borders of the Northern Hemisphere. As Maria da Graça Mateus Ventura has claimed, the choice of New World toponyms was based on 2 distinctive criteria. As from the late 15th century, place names were chosen because they were either functional or evocative, while functional place names were based on configuration, color, or location. Evocative place names referred to mythical, religious, or political events. Within the second group, there is a particular set of toponyms, the origins and use of which can only be understood in light of the impact of classical knowledge on European New World encounters. Towards 1542, for example, the Amazons, former enemies of the Greeks and the Scythians, became the place name of the river explored by a Spanish conquistador, Francisco de Orellana. Another place name in this group is that of the island of Thule, whose subsequent displacements I intend to analyze in search for an answer to the second question posed at the beginning of this presentation. The first appearance of the Thule toponym can be traced back to the 4th century before Christ. Thule was the name given by Greek voyager Pytheas of Massilia, Marseille nowadays, to an island he allegedly visited in the northern limits of the known world, after he had sailed past the British Isles for 6 days. Because there are no remaining documents of Pytheas' voyage, the report of its location survived indirectly in the works of classical authors such as Pliny the Elder, Strabo, Pomponius Mela, and Claudius Ptolemy. According to Pytheas, Thule was located south of the Arctic Circle. It was, can you see the picture?
No, it's not there. Well, yeah, there we go.
Here. Sorry, I do apologize for this. Okay. So Thule was located south of the Arctic Circle. It was the northernmost island in the British Isles and the last inhabited place towards the north. Ptolemy's representation of Thule in the 2nd century AD marked the world maps that would follow, as did the maps of northern Europe that circulated in the Western Hemisphere. Since late antiquity, Thule's location in the British world was thus privileged, although its exact coordinates remained subject of debate. Symbolically speaking, as from classical antiquity, Thule acted as the border island that closed or completed the northern margins of the inhabited world. Here we see not a classical antiquity map, but a Middle Age map or early modern map of Olaus Magnus. And this follows as this. The many literary and geographical references to Thule, from its mythical origins to the island's transformation into a poetic metaphor, or its political uses in the mid-20th century, have been reconstructed in rigorous and comprehensive works on the history of the island. The displacement of the toponym towards the end of the 18th century, however, has not been studied in depth so far. In his second voyage around the world between 1772 and 1775, James Cook was commissioned to sail past the Arctic Circle to determine, or as far south as possible, to determine whether a southern continent existed or not. When sailing 60 degrees south latitude, Cook used the Thule toponym to name the furthermost island of the South Sandwich Archipelago. His journal entry for January 31st, 1775 says, quote, "At the same time, another elevated coast appeared in sight. I called this land Southern Thule because it is the most southern land that has yet been discovered. It shows a surface of vast height and is everywhere covered with snow," end quote. But why was Thule reappearing in the antipodes of the known world? If we return to the question outlined at the beginning of this presentation regarding Thule's process of dislocation, we will probably find the answer in 3 moments of Europe's overseas expansion. Let's go to the first moment. The first dislocation of Thule can be traced back to the late 15th and early 16th centuries. In the account of his 3rd voyage to the New World, Christopher Columbus interprets the verses of Seneca's Medea, written in the 1st century AD, as a prophecy he believes to have fulfilled, which was the discovery of new worlds, undescribed by the ancients. As the chorus in Medea stated, quote, "There will come an age in the far-off years when ocean shall unloose the bonds of things, when the whole broad earth shall be revealed. Then Tethys shall disclose new worlds, and Thule not be the limits of the lands," end quote. Columbus, his son Fernando, and the Spanish chroniclers of the first decades of discovery, such as Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo or Fray Bartolomé de las Casas, saw in the figure of the Italian navigator the incarnation of the myth. In fact, as James Romm has pointed out, not only was Seneca's text altered in ways that made it better fit the discovery of the Americas, but the story of the discovery may have been likewise rewritten to better conform with the prophecy of the Medea, conveniently enough. Although Thule is not used as a place name, to Columbus and his contemporaries, the island had become a metaphor for the limits of the known world, which had now moved to the equinoctial line, the first limit or obstacle encountered by European overseas expansion was in fact the crossing of the torrid zone, which was deemed impossible to cross since classical antiquity. Let's pass to the second displacement of Thule, or what I think is the second displacement of Thule. In line with the emergence of a new benchmark for overseas expansion, Thule's second dislocation occurs in the last decades of the 18th century. By 1760, the touchstone for European maritime powers was no longer the equinoctial line, which had been crossed in the first voyages of exploration, but the elusive Terra Australis. Indeed, while the inhabitability of the torrid zone posed by the ancients had been ruled out, the search of a southern continent in the antipodes of the known world had become a goal for European maritime rivals. The Thule toponym appears in that new limit of the known world, and more specifically in the Malouine or Falkland Islands. Indeed, Thule's second dislocation occurs in the context of the French occupation of the Malouine Islands between 1764 and 1767. Of the many accounts written on the first French colony on the islands, two travel accounts are of particular interest. First, the Voyage autour du monde, written by Louis-Antoine de Bougainville and published in 1771. Secondly, the Histoire d'un voyage aux îles Malouines, written by the expedition's on-board chaplain, Joseph Antoine Pernetti. Both accounts, let's do a close-up to the Malouine Islands. Both accounts state that when taking possession of the islands in February 1764, inside an obelisk built for the occasion, Bougainville placed an engraved medallion containing the map of the colony's buildings and the following phrase: Tibi serviat ultima Thule, or remote as Thule is to be subject to thee. Unlike Columbus, the reference to Thule comes from Virgil's Georgics, and in the aftermath of France's defeat in the 7 Years' War between 1756 and 1763, it was intended to show the extension of King Louis XV's world domains. Like Thule, the Malouine or Falkland Islands represented for France the limits of the inhabited world. Interestingly enough, northern Thule was still an object of interest in France, and in particular to Jean-Pierre de Bougainville, brother of Louis-Antoine. In 1753, Jean-Pierre had published in Paris a dissertation on the voyages of Pytheas of Massilia, with which he had won an award at the Académie Royale des Inscriptions et Belles-Lettres in 1745. The connection between Jean-Pierre's study of Thule and his brother's choice of Virgil's quotation has yet to be explored, and I won't delve into that now, but I will pass to the third dislocation of Thule, which goes back to the quotation I read on Cook's second voyage around the world. So let us now pass to the third and last dislocation of Thule, which occurs a few years later during James Cook's second voyage around the world. Unlike the previous two displacements, in this third and last dislocation, the name Thule is no longer a metaphor, as it has become a specific place name of the southernmost island in the South Sandwich Archipelago. Regarding the reasons behind the choice of this toponym, there are certain divergences that are worth mentioning, as they might help better explain this process of displacement. So far, we have seen how in his journal entry of January 31st, and this is one of the maps that are part of Cook's journal, we have seen how in his journal entry of January 31st, 1775, Cook explains, quote, "I call this island Southern Thule because it is the most southern land that has yet been discovered." If we were to follow the criteria proposed by Maria da Graça Mateus Ventura, in Cook's case, the Thule place name does not follow a functional, but an evocative criterion. Due to its geographical characteristics and its location, Southern Thule evokes the antipodal, yet mythical, Northern Thule. Yet, I believe there may have been other reasons to explain this choice apart from its metaphorical uses. In the first place, the fact that Cook read Bougainville's travel account may have also influenced his choice of the Thule place name. This last hypothesis stands on firmer ground if we take into account that, since classical antiquity, Thule had been associated to the British world, and that in the context of overseas competition in search of a southern continent, the choice of the Southern Thule toponym might have been a way of affirming English preponderance in the South Seas. In fact, early in the 17th century, Sir Francis Bacon had attacked Spain's use of the Senecan prophecy as an unworthy propaganda ploy in the context of Spanish-English rivalry over the New World. So the English are well aware of Seneca's prophecy and of the various uses of Thule. A second and alternative hypothesis is also plausible. In his journal entry for January the 31st, George Forster, who was part of the expedition, and I'll copy the quote, George Forster, who was part of the expedition, writes that the Thule toponym was suggested by his father, German naturalist Johann Reinhold Forster, who was also part of the crew. According to George, quote, this being the furthermost extremity of the land, my father named it Southern Thule, a name which Captain Cook preserved. This does not appear in Cook's journal. It's George Forster that is saying this. There is reason to believe Forster's claim, though. In the observations his father published on the voyage round the world, Northern Thule is mentioned twice. Firstly, in his journal entry for February the 1st, when he describes the discovery of the Sandwich Archipelago. Secondly, when he compares Northern Thule's frozen waters to those found in the southern seas. In the section titled Remarks, and I'll go to the last quotation. There. In the section titled Remarks on the Water and the Ocean, in Johann Reinhold Forster's book, he explains how the North Seas can suddenly freeze. And he says, waters become suddenly coagulated into a kind of paste or dough, and evokes the names given by the ancients to the North Seas: frozen, dead, lazy, immovable sea. In the footnote explaining this citation, he quotes Strabo, who in turn refers to Pytheas of Massilia. In Strabo's words, as they appear in Reinhold's book, he says, quote, near Thule, to the north, the sea is neither land, nor sea, nor air, but a concrete of them all, like sea lungs, which plainly proves that the famous traveler of Marseilles had heard some account concerning the congelation of the sea, which, when compared to other accounts and the names given to this North Sea by the ancients, are together a strong proof that the whole account originated in the Gaelic and Celtic nations, for it is in their language that we must look for the meaning of those names which are found in Pliny, end quote. Forster, father, inserts Thule into the Celtic and Gaelic tradition, which allows us to infer that the choice of the Thule toponym was not only related to the climatic or topographical similarities that could exist between northern and southern Thule. The choice of the Thule toponym was also geopolitical and must be understood in the context of early modern European overseas rivalry. To conclude, I believe the dislocation of Thule was actually a relocation that, just like in classical antiquity, redefined the limits of the known world, yes, but at the same time, and most importantly, reinforced the areas of influence of modern maritime empires. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We will give you our little round of applause there. And then now, Manuel, if you could share your screen and we could hear from you. Thank you very much, Carolina. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Yes, let's do it. So it's working?
It says it's trying to. There we go.
So everyone can see it. So I can start now.
Yes, please.
So good afternoon or good night, everyone, depending on where you are. My presentation is going to be about the toponymy present in not in a map, but on a written document related to cartographic production, that is the diary of the demarcation of the Madrid Treaty between Spain and Portugal. This presentation, as well as the one by Mariana in the section 1, is part of a larger research project oriented by Professor Fábio Kuhn of the Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul, called Deconstructing Maps, Military Engineers, and the Cartographic Production on the Southern Border of Portuguese America. As for my introduction, my research subject is a toponymy present in the diary as the toponymy present at the diary of the Madrid Treaty first edition, and my methodology is a quantitative study of the toponymies present in the diary and a qualitative analysis of their significance in the borderlands disputes between various European and Amerindian actors. Now, as for my concept of borderlands, and the one used by most historians of this region, the Rio de la Plata region or meridional American region, is the frontier not as a demarcation, but as a fluid space, as a process where different actors intermingle in a far more fluid space than you can see on a simple line on a map. And meridional or Latin America in particular as a triple border between not only the Spanish and Portuguese that were rival powers for control of the region, but also the various Amerindian peoples that tried to resist their encroachment into their territory and assert their domain and their right to those lands. Now, to quote two specialists on the subject, Eduardo Naumann, the existence of three toponymies for the same historical region indicates the different interests and disputes present in the same space. And Adriano Comissoli, the frontier didn't end at cartography, in the same way that effective sovereign showed itself to be fluid and uncertain. If at Europe's court it was considered just a line on a map, to the inhabitants of the immediate area, the phenomenon was more one of contact than one of exclusion. The larger historical context behind the Madrid Treaty that I'm going to explain in a moment can be understood as a conflict between a south-north Spanish expansion, because Spanish America was growing, especially in the region that's today Argentina and Uruguay, thanks to a huge boom in the cattle and leather industries. So there was this economic expansion and a population expansion from the south in Buenos Aires up north, and an expansion of Portuguese America also around those industries to the south, and of course the economic boom caused by the gold rush in the interior of what's today Brazil. So the Spanish were coming from south-north and the Portuguese from north-south, and there was a clash between those two European powers and the Amerindian peoples that were caught, for a sense, in the way. And on a larger scale, an increasing importance of toponymy and cartography in European diplomatic and territorial disputes, as Mariana showed you, the princess of ut possets, or right by possession, was coming in vogue in diplomacy of the time, and naming and mapping a place was one of the many ways European powers would try to assert their right to different territories, especially overseas. For the Madrid Treaty, it was signed between Spain and Portugal, aiming at creating a more stable and permanent border between their American domains, and among its many clauses, it had the creation of two demarcation commissions, one for Spain and one for Portugal, that would work together to demarcate the border created by the Madrid Treaty, a border that would also dislocate many Jesuit missions that laid on the borderlands that were inhabited mainly by Guarani people and administered by Spanish Jesuit priests. Now, the main reference for the Madrid Treaty was the famous Mapa das Cortes, one of the better, more accurate maps of South America, made in the middle 18th century. That's also a reference for the main cartographical reference for this presentation. Now, the expeditions, we're going to only focus on one of them. The first one that was supposed to go on a path from Castillos Grandes at the coast of what's today Uruguay up into the Ibicuí River, which was supposed to be the natural border between Portuguese and Spanish America. This expedition would be responsible for mapping the region, for demarcating the region, and registering its fauna and its toponymy and geography into a series of diaries. So it was not only a political, military, and diplomatic expedition, but also a scientific one that left, I think, a valuable legacy in describing the region from the perspective, of course, of European military engineers and scientists that were trying to assert a kind of appropriation of the space different from the one made before by Amerindian peoples that live there. Now, this expedition was cut in half by the expedition was landed in Castillos Grandes in 52, and they went up from, you can see it on this pink line. Was supposed to be the border. They landed in Castillos Grandes here. They went up through what was called Banda Oriental at the time, but they met resistance by the Guarani people living in the missions that were unhappy about being dislocated by the treaty. They went into revolt. The demarcation was stopped in 53 and could only be retaken in 58 after the Guarani Wars, the name given to the pacification of the region by the Spanish and Portuguese that put the Guarani revolt down. So the demarcation was retaken in 58, and it then was able to explore the Bicuí Basin and the mission regions and demarcate the area. So you have a two-part expedition, one in 52-53 at Banda Oriental, and another one in 58 around the Bicuí River and the missions up here. Now, the toponymy present in the diary has a double role because it was both a registration of names given to the region by various peoples in various languages, but also an act of creation because in the previous session, someone raised this question to Mariana about if new toponyms that start to appear in the 18th century as the Portuguese start to appropriate this area are renaming of places with non-native names or creations of places that didn't have a fixed toponymy. Well, we're trying to answer this, analyzing this diary. These new toponymy, so these new toponyms weren't the majority of the ones registered in the diary, but they have some importance, and I will show my quantitative analysis of them and of the various languages that were used to name places in the region. As for my criterion for the quantitative study, we are use all the names present in the diary, 123 of them. The spelling used in the diary that was not always consistent. I went for the first mention of the toponymy in the diary, but there was some internal variation since the diary had multiple authors speaking different languages and different dialects, and they're not always also conforming to modern spelling of those places. I classified them by linguistic origin, the region they were a part of, if they were on the Banda Oriental or the Bicuí Basin, and if they were created by the Commission or only registered by it. Now, seeing this pizza graph of language, you can see here that Guarani, Amerindian language that was predominant in the south of Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, and parts of Argentina, correspond to roughly half the toponymy, followed by Spanish, that was also a major language, and then the Spanish Portuguese. What I call Spanish Portuguese are the toponyms created by the Commission, so by speakers of both languages, and a small minority of Portuguese, Basque, and Minuano. Minuano being another Amerindian language that was not as widespread as Guarani, as the Guarani were a people of mostly settled or semi-nomadic farmers, so they could have a more high population density and would settle a lot near river basins and would influence a lot the toponymy of those rivers. Like the river Uruguay, which names the country of Uruguay, is a Guarani name, means roughly something like the curved river, because if you look at the map of the river Guarani and Uruguay, it's a very curved river. So or the Bigui River, which is also a Guarani name. As for the creation, the vast majority of the toponyms created in this demarcation process that occurred throughout the 50s of the 18th century weren't creations of these commissions. They were mere registrations of toponyms that were already there, and only a small minority were new creations. Now, when we break them down, the toponyms by region, instead of looking at every one of them together, you can see that Spanish was prevalent in the Banda Oriental, Guarani was dwindling, only being one part of the toponyms, and you have a greater diversity of toponyms, including, for example, Basque, that was the name of a place called Cerro de Navarro, Navarro Hill, or Minuano, that was also a name of a few places. Portuguese was the name of one of the small rivers mapped by the commission, was called Arrojo Ventura Silveira, a Portuguese name. So you can see a more diverse toponymy in the Banda Oriental. Now, the Ibicui and the missions were more homogeneous. You had either Guarani names for geographical accidents and rivers. Again, settled people loved to settle. They were people who loved settling near rivers where the land was more humid and fertile for their corn and mandioca plantations. And Spanish names, mostly for settlements, since almost every settlement in the region were either Jesuit missions, Spanish Jesuit missions, or estancias, cattle farms connected to those Jesuit missions. So you can see this Spanish toponymy also present in the area, even if the vast majority of the population of this region was Guarani, but a Guarani people that were in a process of mixing and miscigenagem, as one could call, with European culture to their catechization by the Jesuit priests, and they're settled down in a way of life that wasn't European, but also didn't correspond to their more traditional ways of life. Now going to the toponymy created by the commissions by region, you can see that in Banda Oriental, they had a more significant impact. More than 10% of the toponyms of the diary on the Banda Oriental region are created by these commissions. Those toponyms were, 4 of them were after geographical features or events during the expedition. So there's one, for example, called Cerro das Trovadas, that would be something like the Storm Hill. It's called like that because the night the commissions camped on this hill was a storm night. So they just called it that since there wasn't a name that they knew of. Now, another 4 were named for Catholic saints. As Iris Cantor would point out, it was very common for both the Spanish and Portuguese to name place they quote-unquote discovered after the saint of the day it had been discovered, or the first mass of the colony. So, for example, both a hill discovered, quote-unquote discovered by this commission was called São Paulo because it was discovered on the 6th of January, as well as the city we were supposed to have in this meet is called São Paulo because it was founded in the 6th of January. And there is, I think, the more symbolic toponymy of these 9, that is Cerro dos Reis. It's called that because the commissioners erected a stone marker with the letters RF and RC written down on the stone marker, meaning Rex Fidelissimus and Rex Catholicus, 2 of the honorific titles of the Portuguese and Spanish monarchies, respectively. And they show this attempt to create a borderland by those 2 powers and appropriation of that, using many sources such as monarchy, Catholic saints and martyrs, but there was a consistent project of renaming, as you can see, since many places were also named for, in a more happenstance way, by incidents, by features, or by arbitrary process by the commissions on the ground. Now, on the ubiquity and emissions, the impact of the demarcation on the toponym was null. No new toponyms were created. They don't play on the diary to creating anything new. They only registered the names that were given to the region either by the Guarani or by the Spanish Jesuits. So you can see that at least in the 50s of the 18th century, there were limits to how much the Portuguese could appropriate the region toponymically. Of course, when you look further and you pick up maps by José Custódio that were made during the late 50s or the 60s and other sources, you can see a gradual process of toponymic appropriation, but it wasn't a sudden process, and we must have this in mind when discussing the toponymical appropriation transformation of Latin America or Meridional America.
Thank you.
So just a question, do we still have time?
Yeah, you have about 1 more minute if you want.
More minute? No, I just want to some closing remarks, and I just wanted to point also as well that there was the voices of toponyms, including from languages that as Portuguese in regions that were technically under Spanish control. So they showed that the borderlands weren't a rigid space of only separation and exclusion, but also a fluid space of contact and trades of ideas, where the power of European powers was, at least initially, very limited, and there was a longer process of appropriation and of assertion of European imperial power on the region. So, thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That was very interesting, and it's always wonderful to see pie charts coming in when we're talking about maps. All right, let's go on to our third speaker, and then hopefully we'll have a bit of time left over for a brief discussion. So Brenda, if you'd like to go ahead and share your screen. And yeah, we see it, but we don't hear you, Brenda. You might need to unmute. Brenda, we don't hear you still.
Okay, thank you so much, Catherine. So my work is entitled The Frontier of the Known World, the Allegory of America, and the Images of Artemis in the 16th and early 17th centuries. I'd like to start by saying that this presentation is based on part of my master's thesis, supervised by Professor Andrea Doré, who is watching here. The present research was based on the idea that anthropomorphic representations of America and the Greek goddess Artemis, or Diana in her Roman version, may be related to each other during the 16th and 17th centuries. There are many similarities between the two women, such as the bow and arrows both are depicted with, which I will address throughout this paper. Furthermore, classical authors and mythology were part of inspirations humanists, painters, sculptors, and other artists used in their work, so it was a plausible suggestion. To develop this hypothesis, I chose some images of America and Artemis produced around the same period. The first one is the frontispiece of Abraham Hortelius' Atlas Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, published in Antwerp in 1570. One of the first and better known representations of the continents as women. It is believed that Frans Hogenberg was responsible for the engravings, but that Ortelius supervised his work. It's meaningful that, in what is considered the first modern representation of the parts of the world in human form, America is portrayed as a nude woman, at the bottom of the image if you're seeing it, as a nude woman, characteristic which was subsequently one of the most recurrently associated with the continent. Even naked, lightly covered not by a cloth as in Africa's case, but by her own hair, she is still adorned. The woman is lying down while the other continents are standing, and has a bow and arrows beneath her feet. The club she carries is a reference to the bellicosity of the natives, and also to the habit of eating human meat. The image overall highlights the continent's savagery through nudity and anthropophagy. the distance between the world, the old and the new world. The distancing is accomplished through the opposition between the personifications of the two continents. Europe is at the top of the frontispiece, surrounded by symbols of power, scepter and a crown, sitting on a throne and richly dressed, while America is partially lying at the bottom of the page, literally below and at the feet of Europe. The next image is from Johannes Vrind's, It's from Johannes Vrind's World Map, published in Antwerp in 1596. The map itself is a copy of Petrus Plancius' World Map published 2 years earlier. The changes consist of the decorative borders that present women as women. The changes, as the continents. Vrind's America is a woman astride a giant armadillo, adorned with feather crown in her hair, nearly naked and holding an axe. In the background, it is possible to discern exotic animals and references to anthropophagy. She resembles Ortega's America, even though the engravings have different elements, such as the armadillo. Overall, the narratives generated by these sources do not contradict each other. The third image of America I'd like to address is from Cesare Ripa's emblem book entitled Iconology, whose first edition was published in Rome in 1593. The second edition, published 10 years later, and the source for this research, had 151 woodcut engravings added to, as well as emblems, such as the 4 parts of the word that were not in the original. And that's why I chose this particular edition to use as a source for the research. The illustrations were not credited to any artist, but it can be stated that Ripa was aware and approved the images that accompany emblems since he participated in the production of the edition. America's engravings depict a woman whose hair is adorned with feathers, her right hand holds an arrow and her left a brow, her robes uncovered one of her breasts. She wears a bracelet on each wrist and carries a quiver with arrows by her side. Under her left foot, there is a decapitated decapitated head pierced by an arrow and a lizard or alligator. In the text that is part of the emblem, Cesare Ripa explains that America's nudity is a costume of the local people, as well as the feather accessories. The bow and arrows are combat weapons commonly used by women and men, while the human head, according to Ripa, is sign of the anthropophagy practiced by natives. The exotic giant lizard would be capable of devouring man. The narrative highlights cannibalism, war, cannibalism, and exotic beasts as the main characteristics of the continent. Themes already present in earlier sources, such as Ortelius and Ortelius' Atlas and Vrind's World Map. The next 2 sources I analyze are representations of the Greek goddess Artemis, deity associated with hunting, virginity, the moon, childbirth, and also the border and bordering areas. According to Jean-Pierre Vernant, this deity was responsible for guiding man on the frontiers of the hunting and also on the transition from childhood to adulthood. Her origin is unknown, and Vernant states that there is a distance between Artemis and the other gods in the Greek pantheon, of which she has been part since the 12th century before Christ. Artemis' place in the world is everything that the Greeks include in the word agros: mountains, hills, forests, coasts, places where the cultivated and the wild coexist. As a huntress, Artemis enters the territory of savagery and forms an important part of the education of young people who should also learn to hunt. Diana the Huntress, that is this image, is a painting dated between 1550 and 1560, attributed to the school of Fontainebleau, which refers to French artistic production during the 16th century. Diana is in the center and looks at the observer. Her robes resemble those of Hippa's America, and she also has her left breast uncovered. A buckle fastens the quiver full of arrows to her back. In her right hand, Diana holds an arrow, and in her left, a bow. Her feet are bare, and there is a hunting dog behind her legs. Finally, a small crescent moon adorns Diana's hair. And here you have the images side by side, that of Hippa's America and Diana from the School of Fontainebleau. The second painting is The Death of Actaeon by Titian, which is dated approximately between 1559 and 1575. The Greek author of the 2nd century before Christ, Apollodorus, writes that in the most common version of the story, Actaeon would have seen the goddess bathe, and as a punishment, Diana would turn him into a deer and made his hunting dogs devour him. The elements make the scene recognizable to those who know the story of Actaeon, even if the observer does not know the name of the painting. The woman with the bow and arrow, the dogs attacking a deer-headed man, and the water in which Artemis would have bathed are sufficient in this sense. And here you have the comparison between the images of Hippa's America and the painting from by Titian. Cesare Hippa mentions Diana in his iconology on 2 occasions only. The first occurs in the emblem dedicated to the region of Friuli, which is described by Hippa as a woman wearing sandals similar to Diana's. The explicit reference to the goddess attests to Hippa's knowledge of the representations of this deity, since he uses her as an example of a type of sandal. The other mention of Diana is in the description of her accompanying nymphs. Hippa characterizes them as wearing simple white garments as sign of their virginity, and carrying a bow and arrow quiver at the waist for their hunters. The representations of America and Artemis are similar in at least 2 aspects, form and meaning. Bow, quiver, and arrows are depicted in a very similar way in the works of Cesare Hippa, Titian, and the School of Fontainebleau, including the position of these elements. The bow is in the left hand and the arrow in the right. The quiver is attached to the waist on the left. The robes also resemble each other, uncovering one of the women's breasts. America, according to European sources, is a distant continent, unknown to them until late 15th century, sometimes named Terra Incognita, that is, unknown land, or New World. It is possible to suggest that America, like Artemis, corresponded to the idea of border, since the continent was located on the edge of the known world. Border-related savagery is also present in the representations of America, as war instruments such as bow, arrows, and severed limbs that allude to the anthropophagy practiced by some native groups. Artemis was also the patron goddess of the Amazons, warrior women whose existence is still debated. Narratives from classical antiquity emphasize the warlike quality of these women, who limited their interaction with the opposite sex to war and reproduction. Amazons, like Artemis in the personification of America, were located on margins between men and women, between war and marriage, and on geographical frontiers. Over time, the location of these women was constantly reassigned. From the arrival of Europeans in the New World, part of that mythology was transferred to the continent in an attempt to understand, through already known repertoires, the existence of lands and inhabitants unheard of until then. The question of the existence of Amazons in America was part of that effort. In conclusion, the correspondence between America and Artemis may be interpreted by Irving Panofsky's concept of pseudomorphism, defined as, and I quote, the emergency of a form A morphologic analogous to, or even identical with, a form B, yet entirely unrelated to it from a genetic point of view, end of quote. America's images do not necessarily derive from Artemis, but the connection between them is noticeable and can be understood as an update or readjustment of the motif to new contexts. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That fit in very well. And now we have time for discussion. So I'm actually going to direct 2 questions to Carolina first, because she has to moderate the next session, so she needs to go in a couple of minutes. So Carolina, we've had 2 questions come in. One from Carvalho. She asks, the displacement of Thule was a unique case, or was it common practice at the time? And did the displacement of places and the rebaptism of these places, did they come together in some way, or are they not necessarily related? So again, the displacements of Thule was a unique case or common at the time. And then I just wanted to ask you about the use of the word dislocation and how you came to choose that as kind of the theoretical framing of the concept you're describing.
Mm-hmm. Regarding whether it was a unique case or not, so far it appears to be a unique case. I mean, the case of the Amazons, which I mentioned, is not the dislocation of a place name into another place, but the case of Thule does show that there is, that this toponym has changed or has been moving around from the first decades of overseas navigation. So far I would say it is a rather unique case, but we would have to, I mean, this is something I'm just starting with now, so I would have to see whether there are other cases. Perhaps Albion, Nova Albion, could be a similar case, but I mean, so far I would say it is one of the only cases I have seen of late antiquity or early antiquity place names that have moved to the New World and southwards. And regarding your question, Katie, the idea of dislocation, sort of thinking about the concept of dislocation for a long time now, which is sort of very similar to displacement, but at the same time, it means other things. And I started thinking about this term or this category, working on engravings, New World engravings that were used to illustrate different parts of the New World, especially in the debris collection, and reappeared sort of dislocated of their original sources of publication to illustrate and to sort of talk about or to show images of Native Americans or indigenous populations that were not really the images or the populations that they were originally meant to illustrate. So this sort of the moving images made me think of moving place names and toponyms. And suddenly, I mean, I started thinking that Thule could be a good example to show how place names change and go referring to other things. Thule is a very special place name because it is very heavily charged, semantically speaking, metaphorically speaking. So I would say it is almost an exception, but it would be very interesting to continue seeing how these toponyms go displacing or changing or being replaced in other contexts and other situations, right?
Definitely. And one follow-up on that from Quentin, you said you haven't really seen any contemporary examples, but do you think later, possibly into the 19th century or after Cook, that there's other kind of, especially classical examples of taking something that was in one place and had one set of semantic kind of associations and switching them?
In the case of Thule, it later became a star. I mean, the borders of the known world go expanding and expanding further, no? So Thule now is somewhere in the outer space. But I haven't really I work especially on 16th to 18th century overseas European expansion. So, but it is something that is starting. So any ideas or suggestions are welcome, especially with the term of dislocation, which I wanted to test in a way in this presentation and see how feasible it was to talk about this or not. So thank you.
Definitely. Thank you so much. I know that you have to run to start your next
one.
No
thank you all for listening. Bye-bye.
So we'll carry on. We have a couple of questions for Brenda, and then we have a very specific one for Manuel that we might leave to last because it involves screen sharing. So for Brenda, we have a question actually from Carolina, who just left, about have you tried to trace the possible origins, pictorial or mythical, of the other allegories of the 4 parts of the known world, so of the other women on that frontispiece.
Okay, so more or less, like in my thesis, America was like the big focus of it. So, and I know Carolina, I'll maybe send an email for her to her later. So I just like had one chapter dedicated to America in a specific. My third chapter was dedicated to the other allegories in relation to America. So I tried to trace some of the most known, most current interpretations and elements that repeated itself in the allegories of Africa and Europe and Asia mostly. But then America was my focus, so that's why I could make such a detailed research concerning just this one continent. I guess that's it. And I'll send her an email.
Yeah, please do. And in that email, I just had a comment. I wondered in that email too, Carolina, if you can play around with dislocation a bit, because I wonder, it almost seems like Artemis in some ways is being dislocated onto the Americas, and the parts of her allegorical image that especially are about frontiers and leading men in a hunt, that seems to have a lot of rhetorical value for empire and expansion.
Yeah, totally.
Excellent. And then we just had, nope, we have not had another question. Phew, we're going well. So now we've had a question for Manuel from Junia Furtado. And Junia, if you wanted to share your screen and ask a question, it is about a specific toponym.
Hello, Manuel. First, I would like to congratulate everybody. Manuel, this is a map from a private collection, and there is two places here very interesting. It's a Spanish map, and it's connected to just after the Guarani Wars. Here says, here arrived in 1753, the people from the demarcation of the Spanish and Portuguese. But see here, very interesting, there is a lot of skulls and something very difficult to read, Arcangerusa. And here also, it's a grave, Teomonotalca. So I could share with you this map if you want. Because I would like, if you heard something like this in the diaries.
Thank you very much. I am part of, as I said, I'm part of a larger project, and we are collecting anything we can on cartography, be it maps, be it primary source, be it reference papers, and yeah, you can send this to me and I will to analyze, and I can see which toponyms are those and if they're listed in the ones I found in the diary. So maybe but I will have to look it up. My list. But thank you a lot. Thank you a lot.
Great. So we're gonna end on a note of further collaboration, hopefully between colleagues. This has been a wonderful panel. The papers fit together very well. I want to thank all the panelists again. So if we can put up our reaction signs again, it was a wonderful panel, and thanks everyone for coming. And now hurry on to whichever book chat you want to go to, or else really take a real coffee break. Thank you so much, everyone. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.